This year, Christians in Science hosted their Coping with Controversy conference online. Now, this event was an opportunity to open up and explore some of the big issues and topics within the church that we can often find quite hard to talk about, mostly because there is such a wide range of views on these particular issues. We heard from some brilliant speakers, and these recordings are available to you now. But, and this comes with a bit of a disclaimer, you may not agree with these speakers, you may agree with these speakers, but what we want these talks and recordings to do is open up the opportunity to begin talking, discussing, and listening to each other about how we understand these issues for the church. So however you choose to use these resources, we hope you find them valuable, if it's just for yourself or maybe to begin discussions as a small group or community.
Great, well, thank you for asking me today. It's interesting because I quite often talk about issues like stem cells and embryonic stem cells and IVF and things like that. But I think abortion is more generally a subject with consensus across the Christian church, although obviously quite markedly different from some of the secular approaches. So that's why I called today's talk Controversy, What Controversy? Because some of you might be thinking, well, who's saying abortion's a good thing? Well, nobody is in the church is saying it's a good thing, but there are a number of issues, historically and contemporary issues, on which Christians do have debate and questions about. So what I'm going to do today is start off with some science, and my apologies to any of you who have training in the natural sciences and are well aware of the stages in human development, but please bear with us because obviously people have different kind of scientific backgrounds here. I'm going to look at the stages in human development pre-birth with a particular focus on the very early stages, because those are the ones over which there is more controversy and disagreement, or not so much maybe controversy, but just debate amongst Christians as well as again across the secular thinkers. So we're going to look at that first to kind of set the scene for what we're talking about, the scientific context, if you like, and then I'm going to do a quick whiz through historical approaches to the subject of terminating human development. And I'm using that language because obviously people of centuries before didn't necessarily use the same language as us, and they didn't have the same kind of, if I put embryology, you know, their ideas of what went on during development were quite different to ours. So the idea of stopping a pregnancy, of terminating a pregnancy to stop it going full length, that's been kind of discussed over historical periods. So we're going to look at that before ending with the contemporary debate. So I've put here a diagram which comes from Wiki, but there's loads of these things on the web if you want to another time. What you're looking at basically is a section of half of a womb, a uterus, and then the thing that looks like an arm coming out with a load of fingers is, I'm trying to get into the camera here, is the fallopian tube leading to the ovaries. So you kind of look a section through half, and obviously in a human body you've got the same on the other side. So you have here a diagrammatic representation of what happens during human fertilization and development. So the ovary releases generally 1 egg per month, but sometimes more than one. We know that because I'm sure we're all aware you can get non-identical twins, and this is where 2 eggs get released in the same month. They both get fertilized, they both end up getting embedded in the wall of the uterus and developing full term. So they've got different genetic selections in each egg from the mother, and different sperm fertilizing them. So 2 completely different human beings developing at the same time. But generally, most often, there's just 1 released per month during a woman's fertile years, as it were. If some sperm get into the body from following intercourse and are able to swim up the fallopian tube, that's this arm thing, they can reach the egg, and you see these pictures sometimes of loads of them all around the outside of the egg. But once one of them gets in, then it sets in chain a cascade of reactions which prevent any of the others getting in. And that's essential, because if you end up with the wrong number of chromosomes in the cell, it won't develop. It's not viable. You have to have the right genetic component. Most major differences in numbers of chromosomes will result in the developing entity not going full term to give a born human, if you like. So you've got this mechanism, and you've got your right number of chromosomes in, and obviously the pictures that you see of this is in nature, this is happening in the woman's body. The pictures that we see are all the result of developments in technology over the last few decades, which have allowed fertilization and these first few stages to be carried out in vitro. Literally means in glass, but of course it's actually a plastic petri dish in most cases, in the laboratory, IVF, and millions of children have now been born through IVF. So you've got this development progressing, and you can see, if you follow the diagram round, there's two little purple blobs, and then it goes down to one little purple blob. I can't, if I wave my mouse around, can you see here? Does that show my arrow on the screen? I'm not sure if oh no, hang on, there. Okay, so at this stage, the genetic material from the sperm and the egg has come together. Now that takes up to about 30 hours. So in fact, you know, the old adage, wham bam, thank you ma'am, even the sperm getting into the egg is a process. It takes time. It would be difficult to know when to start a stopwatch if you needed to say, this is where the new life begins. We've got, for the first time in the history of the universe, this particular set of human DNA in one cell. But when it actually starts is a bit blurry. It's a process. So you start with this one cell, and you know, you don't need me to do the maths. It divides into 2 after about 36 hours, then 4, then 8, then 16, and so on. And eventually you get a ball of cells that then forms, actually after a while, a hollow ball. And the hollow ball are the cells that are going to help form the attachment to the wall of the uterus and form the placenta. And inside that hollow ball is another little clump of cells, which is actually going to form the human body as it grows. So that's what this little blue blob here is. That's the bit that's going to form the human body. And as you can see, between a week and a half it takes before this developing human actually embeds in the wall of the uterus, and then development can proceed. Up to that point, this entity is entirely self-motivated, if you like. It doesn't gain anything, it's not nourished by anything, it's just on its own. And then at that stage, the physical relationship with the mother to be, if it goes all the way, starts, and it can start drawing nutrients from the uterine wall. Now, what's particularly fascinating about development of any kind, but human development, is the plasticity of these early stages. So at this stage, at these early stages here, 4 and 8 cells, you can take 1 or 2 cells out of the clump. This is in the petri dish, obviously in the lab. You can take 1 or 2 cells out, and you can find out whether the embryo is carrying a particular gene. And that's obviously been important in considerations of genetic disorders. So where a family have the mother and the father are both carrying genes which cause disease, you want to ensure that the embryo doesn't have 2 copies and therefore have a severe impairment. And so you can select the embryos that don't carry that gene. You can take 1 or 2 cells out, and what's left will still give you a whole human being. You can only do that for those very early stages, but you've got this plasticity, if you like, in development. And in fact, that plasticity is underlined by the fact that up to 2 weeks after fertilization, when the sperm gets in, after 2 weeks, up to 2 weeks, in some cases, and we don't know all the details why, in some cases that little ball of cells can split into two and give you identical twins. So it's not the same as the non-identical twins, but as the identical twins. They've got exactly the same genetic constituents, but for some reason you get two separate, distinct human bodies forming. And of course, sometimes that doesn't happen quite so cleanly, and that's when those rare occasions you get Siamese twins, where the two develop, but they're still attached in part. And again, to underline the plasticity at this stage, we now know that in some cases, non-identical twins at this very early stage can, in some way, we don't know how, kind of bump into each other and merge and form one human body. And this only became, but people only became aware of this with genetic testing. One case particularly came to light was a woman in Israel who took her child for a paternity test. And when the results came through, they said, well, he's the father, but you're not the mother. And she's kind of going, I saw it come out, yes, this is definitely my baby. But in fact, what had happened was that they'd taken, I don't know whether it was a blood sample or a sample from the lining of the mouth, the standard ways of doing DNA sampling. And the genetic makeup of the cells they had sampled was different from the genetic makeup of her reproductive organs. So her reproductive cells were a different genetic makeup. So she was in fact composed of cells of two completely different genetic makeups. She was basically two non-identical twins that had fused and formed one body. So this just underlies the plasticity of human development. And it always leaves me amazed that any of us come out with one head, 2 arms and 2 legs, to be honest. It's amazing, brilliant process, the development of the human being. After 2 weeks, the cells in this lump of cells start to specialize and be destined to form specific parts of the body. And so after that point, you can't get identical twins. And it's the beginning of the nervous system. You can see the primitive streak. You can see this line of cells, and you know which one end of the developing human is the top and the other end's the bottom. By the end of 5 weeks, you've got the basic rudiments of most of the body in place. And by the end of 12 weeks, it's basically all there, all the organs, the limb buds, everything just has to get bigger in various proportions over the rest of the pregnancy. So but from 12 weeks, pretty much everything is there in tiny, and it's just a few millimeters long, obviously. The time at which the mother feels the developing child move can vary, but it's usually some weeks after that. And with current technology, it's around 22, 23 weeks, the earliest that a child can be kept alive if they're born prematurely. So if they're born at they have had a few survive from 21 weeks, I think that's the absolute earliest, but very often they have disabilities resulting from that premature birth. The limiting factor is that the lungs don't produce the protein that enables them to open up. It's a factor to help them open up and breathe. And so it's unlikely that certainly with current technology, we're going to be able to support infants that are born more than 21 weeks prematurely. But that's kind of the limits with current technology. And of course, then the development goes on. After birth, humans continue to grow. We're not the kind of species that just drops our young and they're ready to follow the herd a few hours later. Our progeny take a long, long time to grow up. As I once described them, ectoparasites for 18 years at least. But anyway, so there is this wonderful process of development, which never fails to amaze me. But it does raise a number of questions. The more we know about early development, the more wondrous it is, but the more we're left with questions as to what the status is of these early stages in human life. it annoys me no end when people say, well, when does life begin? Because it's never dead. The sperm are alive, the eggs are alive, the fertilized egg is alive. It's never not alive, and it's definitely human. The chromosomes there, the genetic information is human, it's Homo sapiens. The question is, and I prefer to use the language of personhood, the question is, when is this a person? When, at what stage in this developmental process, do we treat this entity, this developing human, in exactly the same way, with the same rights and respect as you or I? Or as one newspaper editor put it once in a comments question, I have difficulty thinking of this as the same as the lady next door. it's the lady next door test, if you like. So we've got this entity, this very early human embryo, which we can say it's in some cases referred to as an individual, but we don't actually know in the normal processes of development. This could form an individual. It could form half an individual if it bumps into another non-identical twin. It could form two if it splits to give identical twins, or it could, with estimated 70% of human beings at this stage, could end up getting flushed out in the process because the uterine wall is not at the right state to receive it, or there's something genetically wrong with it, and so it doesn't carry on developing. So we don't know the fate of this entity. Later on in pregnancy, where obviously it looks human, this entity looks human. We know it's human at the earlier stage, but it looks human, and the chances of its survival are much greater. But again, we're still asking this question of when we treat this the same way as our next door neighbour. When is this a person? Now, it has to be said, in British law at the moment, it isn't a person with full rights until it's born, by caesarean or naturally. At that point, it acquires all the protections that you or I have, and you cannot kill it. Infanticide is murder. Before that, as you know, I'm sure the laws of the country allow different things at different stages of development. And certainly after 24 weeks of gestation in the womb, abortion termination is only allowed if the mother's health is definitely severely threatened, or if there is severe developmental abnormality in the developing human. So if, for instance, the brain isn't developing, and you know that this human being will only survive maybe a day or two once it's born because it hasn't got the brain to maintain life, then you can have a termination later on in pregnancy. But it does result in the, ethicists are fond of coming up with weird stories. It does result in the kind of paradoxical idea that if, for instance, somebody turned up 8 months pregnant and they just discovered, it wouldn't happen generally, but if they just discovered that this human being didn't have a brain and it wasn't going to survive. So they could say, okay, to this woman, they could say, come in tomorrow, we will terminate this pregnancy because this human being is not going to survive. So we're allowed, it's severe abnormality, we can do an abortion tomorrow. And so they can arrange to do that. But if she goes home and comes into labour naturally that evening and delivers the baby, they can't kill it. So the day before they could, the day after they can't. That's the state of the British law, because law has black and white. Law can't deal in greys. So law has to say, well, at this stage, it's a human being with the rights of a person. And at this stage, it isn't. It doesn't have the rights of a person. Now, back in time, let me take you back to biblical times and think about the Christian reflection on stopping pregnancy across the years. And going back to the very beginnings of the church, Christians obviously inherited a lot of their theology from their Jewish heritage. And what the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, we now have the same as our Old Testament. So we have the prohibition of murder, which is clear in the Bible. I think that is one that nobody does object to. You've got female and male, which I always think is striking in the Bible. It's not just one gender, as we would now put it. It is all human beings. And actually, in the context of the time, it's remarkably egalitarian, because in many of the surrounding faith systems, the king was the image of God, not everybody else. So in Jewish thought, which is inherited by the church, men and women are made in the image of God. And that's linked in Genesis 9, verse 6, is linked clearly with the prohibition against murder. Blood will be required from those who kill others, because humans are made in God's image. This is where this comes from. And this results in both Jewish and Christian populations of around the 1st century, say, being noted for the fact that they did not practice infanticide. Now, infanticide was, while there were a few voices raised against it in Greek and Roman writers, largely was accepted in the 1st century and for some years thereafter. It was something that the father of the family had the right of life and death over any children born. If there was something wrong with the child, or if it was illegitimate, or if the father even thought it might be illegitimate, or any other reason, they were quite within their rights. There was no restriction on them legally against just killing or abandoning the newborn. And people would be known for leaving them in the streets or leaving them on the rubbish tips even. And it was in fact known that some people got cheap slaves by picking up the abandoned babies and raising them in their household as a slave. It was a way to acquire a cheap slave if you didn't mind waiting a few years. So it's interesting then that the Christian writers actually say it in one point, you're saying this Christian sect are up to all these odd things and we're dodgy and we kill people. We don't even kill our babies like you do. So this is something that is a remarked difference between Jewish and Christian populations that don't expose their children, don't kill them, whereas it was perfectly acceptable. Interestingly, the prohibition against murder is derived from humans being made in the image of God. It isn't to do with them having a soul or a rational soul. And just point that out before we go on to look at the influence of Greek thought. This is something that derives from our relationship with God, not something we've been given that animals haven't been given. And if you want to unpack that later, we can talk a bit about that later. Hugely influential on both Jewish and Christian writers of around 100 or so years before Christ and thereafter are the Greek philosophers. Greek philosophy was dominating that whole kind of Mediterranean area. Even though the Roman Empire was ruling, the Romans pretty much kind of adopted Greek philosophy and made it their own. However, it's a mistake, like it would be to say, oh, 1st century Jews thought. You can't say that, because there were different groups of Jewish people. There were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots to start with, that all had different ideas. So we have to avoid making sweeping generalizations. But so some Greek philosophers thought some things, some thought others, but two of the most influential strands of thought from Greek philosophy are those of Plato and those of Aristotle. And the Platonic ideas largely that went into the church and influenced church thinking largely were that the soul was distinct from the body. It was, in Plato's mind, pre-existing and went into the body at birth, during conception, and then left the body when they died. And certainly in Platonic thought, there's this sense that the body could be seen negatively. So there was, you know, spiritual was good and lovely, and physicality was a bit dirty and messy and earthy, and the soul was trapped in the body. And obviously some of these ideas did feed through into some Christian thinking, unfortunately. But this was an influence on some Christian theologians who picked up this idea of the soul entering the body and thought that the soul entered at conception when intercourse took place. So this idea was prevalent amongst quite a few Christian thinkers in the early centuries. Another influence on Christian theology, but at slightly different times, was the thinking of Aristotle. And both of these lived hundreds of years before at the time of Christ, but their writings were very well known. Now, Aristotle disagreed with Plato about the nature of the soul. He had ideas of plants having a nutritive soul, a sort of basic soul, and then animals had something else. And the humans had a rational soul. And Aristotle thought that the lower souls were kind of more integrated into the body of the organism, whatever it was, but that the rational soul that humans only had, human males perhaps, I'm not sure, I'll have to check whether Aristotle thought women had rational souls. We'll have to ask Adrian later. But this human rational soul was detachable from the body. And it couldn't be destroyed. So this soul in Aristotle's thinking was related to the form of the body. And the relevance of this for our topic today is that the ancient writers, and you find this in some of the Old Testament and New Testament wording, they used the language of formation with regard to human development. So if you think you're living in ancient Israel or ancient Greece, and all you know about the way that development progresses is if you see natural miscarriages. So you think about what might come out if people have miscarriage, and you get that idea of what's going on inside. And so they thought that human development started as blood and water. And then there was this kind of setting, if you like. They talk about curdling. Job talks about God curdling him. And then gradually the form, the shape of a human, because they knew that later on what came out looked more human. And so formation was the shaping, the appearance of a human shape in the developing human in the womb. And Aristotle thought that the soul was related to this shaping of the body, and also came up with the idea that the soul only came into the body once it was of human form. So people picked up this idea, and there was also, I haven't got time to go into a biblical passage in Exodus that had got rather mistranslated through the Greek that also influenced them. But they got this idea, which came into medieval theology, that ensoulment, the soul came in at some point during development, not at the beginning, but once the developing human looked human. And so that idea comes in partly from Aristotle's thought. So going back to the church specifically, this is supposed to be a shot of the catacombs. In early Christian writing, the Didache is probably 1st century or maybe slightly later. They are told they shan't kill a child by abortion, nor kill it after it's born. Tertullian, 2nd century, talks about abortion being murder because the fruit is already present in its seed. It's actually in a tiny form in the human body. It's already there. So even though it's only tiny, it's still fully human and it shouldn't be destroyed. Athenagoras, again from the 2nd century, talked about women who use drugs to bring on abortion and commit murder. He says, we don't murder people. What about, amongst you, people who will take drugs and kill children within them? So this is seen as murder in his writing. And John Chrysostom, slightly later, 4th century in Byzantium, apparently having to address the church congregation to tell them not to go to use prostitutes, which is an interesting point in itself. But one of his reasons for them not going to use prostitutes was that if you go and sleep with a prostitute, she gets pregnant, she will have an abortion, because obviously she has to keep working. And so you are turning her into a murderer by making her do this. So there's clear evidence through the early church centuries that abortion was seen as being equivalent to murder. Interestingly, I perhaps should have mentioned this earlier, in Jewish thought, there isn't any restriction on women using contraceptive techniques. Whereas with some, as we'll, you'll be aware of, I haven't got time to look at that today as well, contraception has been seen as a big issue of debate in Christian teaching across the years. But certainly here, abortion is seen clearly as murder. Now, as I said and hinted with Aristotle, Aristotle's ideas came to prominence more in the medieval period. And this is because although the early church writers had the ancient Greek texts, they were kind of lost to Western Europe for a time, and then they became available again through Islamic scholars that had translated them, and they came in through Spain, and so they kind of hit the medieval monasteries and the thinkers there during probably 11th, 12th century. So Thomas Aquinas and others worked with Aristotle's texts, and Aquinas and others agreed that abortion was a sin, definitely in line with church thinking throughout the ages. But the question was it homicide? Was it actually the same as murder? And so some thinkers in the Middle Ages, and this became enshrined in some Catholic teaching, taught that although abortion was a sin at any stage, if you did it later on, it was murder. And if you did it earlier on, it wasn't murder because the soul hadn't entered the body. And therefore, the church set penance for people who were involved in abortion, and the penance was more severe for a later abortion than it was for an early one. And then we come to the modern church teachings. Now, in the 19th century, the developments of science, in fact, changed the minds of those in the Catholic Church regarding when to treat the developing human termination as murder. And they came to the conclusion, having seen the stages in human development, that they should assume that ensoulment was happening at fertilization. So they say they don't know when the soul is going in. You can't find a soul or see it or weigh it. As they say here, no experimental datum can be in itself sufficient to bring us to the recognition of a spiritual soul. And it's interesting here, they're drawing on science. Nevertheless, the conclusions of science regarding the human embryo provide a valuable indication for discerning by the use of reason a personal presence at the moment of this first appearance of a human life. How, they ask, how could a human individual not be a human person? This sums up a number of teachings in Catholic documents over the 20th century. This is from 1995. So there is this idea still in this teaching that it's a soul present, and that this soul renders the human a human being as a person, and therefore its destruction would be equivalent to murder. This view is taken by some Protestant thinkers. I've just pulled one out here because you can find this one on the web. The Christian Institute claims that the Bible is clear that life begins at conception. This, again, I would take great issue with, and I know evangelical conservative scholars who would take issue with it being clear that life begins at conception, since the Bible doesn't know anything about the early stages of human development and does not make it clear. But it's certainly a view shared for various reasons by some Protestant thinkers. On the other hand, you get a more nuanced from other churches. So the Church of England, this is from 2007, from when they were giving evidence regarding IVF and human experimentation. We do not regard the pre-implantation embryo, that's before it joins onto the wall of the uterus. We do not regard the pre-implantation embryo as yet having the same status of a person made in the image of God. So that would be up to 8 or 10 days. Neither do we believe that the in vitro embryo is devoid of moral weight or consideration. So they're saying this is a developing human being. It isn't like a toenail or a piece of tissue sample that you can do what you like with. It needs some respect. But we're not saying that we think this is a person before it's even embedded in the wall of the uterus. So there is this kind of range of different opinions, but again, clear teaching that abortion is not good. Now, I just want to outline a few points of debate, which hopefully will get things going in terms of questions afterwards. So current debate within and outside the church, and I don't think we can do this in a vacuum because we're aware how strongly opinions are held outside the church on this subject. So the controversies arrange around a number of points. One is the conflicting rights. Women's rights have obviously come to the fore hugely over the last century in a way that they weren't considered before. As I was going to point out, even before Adrian mentioned it, most of the aforementioned opinions have been the opinions of men. There's hardly any women thinkers in any of that. Now we're more aware of the rights of the would-be mother if the pregnancy continues. I've put host here to be a little more objective about it. Writers of various stripes would defend the right of the woman to decide what to do with her own body, and some have likened it to, would a man accept either being chained to a bed for 9 months to keep somebody alive, or even carrying something around which gets heavier and heavier every week for 9 months, and you're told that you have to do this because it will save somebody's life. Would you do that? Would you carry that around? And on all the bad health that it accrues to you as well, because it's a strain on your system. The kind of thing that we're asking people to do requires thought. Then there are the questions about when the developing human acquires the rights due to a born human, which, as I said, in English law is when you're born. Although there are some restrictions, you can't terminate an undamaged fetus before after 24 weeks, unless the mother's health is at risk. And then the whole question of ensoulment, which some modern thinkers are asking us to rethink the influence of Greek philosophy on Christian theology across the past 2 millennia, in terms of the fact that the Hebrew Bible does not speak of a soul entering a body. God breathed the breath of life into Adam, but the breath of life is also, we're found, when we come to the flood account, the breath of life is also in the animals. The view of a Hebrew view of a person is an animated body, is a body that God brings life to. It's not a soul in a body like a driver in a car. And so you get now, in some Christian thinkers will stick with this dualist model. They still talk in terms of soul and body, but other Christian thinkers around now are talking about the human being, is an integrated person, and our abilities to contact God, to be in touch with God, to sense God, everything that makes us human is our emergent properties of who we are and our biology. It doesn't mean that we're just biology and chemistry at all, but it is part and parcel of who we are as embodied persons. We don't have a soul, and that's the wrong kind of language to be using. Then there's the question of how much, if at all, Christians should try to influence the law of the country in terms of imposing our views on legal system. And of course, this is a big deal in the States, where you get the pro-life, pro-choice movements. And then there's a whole subset of questions, a whole raft of stuff on Christian approaches to IVF, genetic selection, and contraception. I've included contraception there because while many contraceptive methods work mostly by stopping that release of that egg each month, and so prevent fertilization with the sperm, many of them, if for some reason they don't work that way, and the morning after pills definitely, if it works, if it's taken at the right time a month, will prevent the egg being released. But if it isn't, a secondary effect of those tablets, some of the hormonal tablets, is to prevent the wall of the uterus being ready to accept the developing embryo as it comes. So if you think that an abortion is anything that stops the development of a fertilized egg onwards, then you could see the morning after pill and some contraceptive techniques as abortifacient, as bringing about abortion. It all hinges on your definition of pregnancy and conception. And again, we can talk about that afterwards if anybody wants to. So the closing questions. As Christians, should we treat this as having the same rights as you or I? Many people would say yes. But what about this? Thank you very much.
So I've got one question to ask Cherryl to start with, and that is, if we are against abortion, maybe in the sort of strongest sense of the child takes absolute precedence even over the mother, what is a constructive way to fight against it? What is the way that we can take that approach even if there are kind of disagreements going on?
Sorry, I'm trying to clarify. Do you mean fight against abortion?
Yes, yeah.
Right, okay. So are you meaning in society or in the church?
Either.
Okay. So, I mean, for the church, I think there's, you know, you can appeal to church tradition and church teachings for the fact that abortion is not a good idea. I think you would have to, in terms of taking precedence over the mother, it depends on whether you mean take precedence over the mother's rights or whether you mean take precedence over the mother's life, because most Catholic, I'm not sure about Catholic, but certainly Jewish tradition would say that the mother's life always takes precedence. So if the mother's life is threatened, they take the viewpoint, the analogy I came across was of your leg. If your leg is healthy and it's not, you can function perfectly, then you don't cut it off any more than you would end a pregnancy. But if your leg is gangrenous, you are entitled to cut it off to save your life. And therefore, if the developing child is threatening your life, then you can cut it out, and that's not a sin. So I think there is certainly a tradition of abortion being bad, but at the same time, there would also be some traditional basis for saying that the mother's life is always gets the priority.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, I guess if we're thinking about society then, and maybe, I guess what we see a lot in society are these sort of pro-life campaigns or picketing events.
Okay, right, those, yeah.
How is there maybe a more constructive approach to that, and what would you advise?
Yeah, I mean, Richard Hayes, who's a conservative evangelical scholar in the States, New Testament scholar, suggests that if the church, and he feels, he feels the testimony is clearly against abortion in scriptures, but he points out that therefore the church has to offer alternatives. And if somebody in the church has an unwanted pregnancy or a pregnancy they're struggling with, a problem pregnancy, then the church should do all they can to support them and put their money where their mouth is, as well as their time. Yeah. Because it's a community, it's the community that has to deal with it, not just, it's not the mother's problem. I mean, abortion is never one person's problem, but in terms, so the church should be there to support and everything. At the same time, he argues that it's not the church's business to try and change the law of the land, because we cannot impose that kind of expectation upon everybody in the country, because they aren't all Christians or they don't all have supportive agencies there. So he doesn't suggest lobbying to change it at the state level, but he says within the church you can give that kind of environment where it isn't necessary for anybody to have an abortion.
What does the Bible say about the value of human life before pregnancy?
Before pregnancy?
As in, I imagine. Oh,
Oh, sorry, I meant before, like, the baby comes out.
Oh, right, before birth, right.
Before birth, yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. The Bible doesn't say anything about abortion. It's one of those where, I don't think the Bible is a textbook of subjects to look up. And we would love it to be sometimes, but it isn't. It's a collection of stories, poetry, life stories, everything that together tells us different aspects of the way God deals with people and the way people have responded to God. So it isn't a textbook. You can't look, but there aren't any specific instructions, nor are there any clear indications regarding circumstances where it might happen. What we have got in Exodus is a passage where two men are having a fight and one of them accidentally, it seems, hurts a woman such that now the Hebrew is much debated. Some people argue it means the woman has a miscarriage, and some people argue it means the woman has a premature birth. And it's different conclusions will be drawn depending on how you translate the Hebrew. So it's much contended. So basically, in summary, one reading would say, if the woman has the baby, but she's all right, has the baby miscarries, but she's all right, then there's a fine to pay, because the husband-to-be is to pay to the husband because he's lost his baby, not her, to him. But if the mother is injured, then there's an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, kind of that sort of vendetta limiting retribution. Other translations would interpret it as saying, if the baby comes out and the baby's okay, it's a fine. But if the baby comes out and the baby's injured, it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So the first interpretation puts the mother's life at a higher value than the child in the womb. And the second interpretation puts them at the same. So he pays your money and you take your choice. Basically, I've seen the same verse used for both arguments, but that's the only verse that has anything even tangentially to do with abortion. So
wow. I've got a really nice kind of, I guess, a question about what can we actively do in response to some of the things we've been talking about today. And this question comes in on Padlet saying, since about 98% of cases, the reason for an abortion is giving as protecting the mental health of the mother, what can we do to protect the mental health of a mother without the need for them to choose abortion?
This is probably not my field, but I would say that I think I sent you a link, Steph. I don't know if it went in with the pack. It's worth listening to. There's some recordings on BBC from the women's magazine, Women's Hour, where they had women talking about abortions. And they had one woman there who was married with 3 children. She'd had increasingly difficult spells of postnatal depression. And the third one, she'd been ill for 10 months. And she'd just come out of this third bout of postnatal depression. And they had a leaky condom. And so she took a morning after pill the next day just to be on the safe side. And she still got pregnant. And she said, I could not face the thought of another pregnancy and another spell of depression. I think I'd have killed myself. She said, it wouldn't have been good for me. It wouldn't have been good for my husband. It wouldn't have been good for my 3 children. So she went for an abortion, and she was talking about the whys and wherefores. And she said, when she went, they told her, and I don't know whether this is general practice or not, they said to her, oh, did you know it's twins? And she's going, that would have killed me, two coming. She said, if it had been the second pregnancy, absolutely fine. But the 4th pregnancy, she'd taken all the right precautions. She'd been responsible. She was in a position where she simply could not face the pregnancy. Now, how could we have helped her through that? I don't know whether we could, because postnatal depression is not something you can get in and do for somebody. I think this was a genuinely tragic situation in which that was probably the best solution. So I think there's a danger in which we can sail in, with our crusader hat on, and we'll sort it, we'll help. But there are some things where it may just be, sadly, the only thing to do.
Yeah, and I guess that's the difficulty with a topic like this, among all the topics we're looking at over the course of this weekend, is that every situation is different, and we've got to approach each situation with the love that Jesus teaches of us, to make the best of whatever we're trying to deal with. I've got a slightly different direction we're going to go now, and then we will break for lunch. But we've had a question asking, and it's a very big question actually, what makes a human human? Is it the DNA, intelligence?
Good question.
Form, something else? What do we see makes a human?
Okay, so in biological terms, a species is not something fixed. You know, things are changing. There's fluidity all the time. Things are the genetic profiles are changing, and that's the whole process of evolution. So what is a human now at this point in time? You could sort of say, well, you know, most humans have this set of DNA and these characteristics, etc. So that you know, the scientific answer, if you like. The biblical answer again is difficult because, as I said earlier, this breath of life is something we share with the animals. In the biblical terms, the thing that distinguishes us from everything else in creation is the fact that we are made in the image of God. What that means, however, has been, you know, there have been papers and books written on what does it mean. For centuries, it was thought to mean anything that might distinguish us from animals. So people talked about walking on two legs, they talked about language, they talked about rationality, tools, all those sorts of things. But biologically, as a friend of mine said once, we may be unique as a species, but we are not uniquely unique. There's nothing we do that no other species does at all. We do language brilliantly, but some species do language. We do tool making brilliantly, but so do crows. So if you're looking for something that ticks the human box only, it's difficult. The image of God has been more recently has been interpreted in a relational sense in terms of our relationship with God and with one another. I'm doing the Trinity, the kind of communitarian thing. And others have been drawing more recently on our role. We're made in the image of God. Well, the images of God, we're representing God's rule, and we should be representing God and looking after creation, dominion in the divine sense of caring and nourishing. And so it's a functional thing there rather than something we have. What I would definitely say is there's no biblical evidence for us being the thing that has a soul, a rational soul that animals don't have. There is no biblical basis for that, I would argue.